Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 300 of Humanity Rising. It's a delight to be able to say that we've had 300 sessions of Humanity Rising since we launched last May, with a commitment to continue our broadcasts day by day for as long as the pandemic unfolds. Little did we know back last spring of 2020 that the pandemic would still be with us, and in fact, deepening its tenacity and its virulence around the world. Yesterday, we had a very profound session on the emotional pandemic. And I wanted to just raise this as we begin our session today, because the Gallup polling organization released a study this morning of over 100 countries. They interviewed people, as they have for many, many years, and their finding is that over the last 12 months, the percentage of emotional negativity and negative feelings that people have been experiencing has reached almost unprecedented levels, as people all around the world have been in lockdown, in isolation, engaging in physical distancing. That's taken a toll on our emotions. And I wanted to bring this in today for this particular session because the common theme of people reporting the increase in emotional negativity was due to isolation and a feeling that they were disconnected from the rest of reality, and a feeling that they were entering into what they called alienation about the world. As it turns out, the country that is experiencing the most alienation is Iraq, followed by Egypt and Tunisia and Mali, Ecuador, all countries that, in addition to the pandemic, have been experiencing, as Iraq, of course, is an example, all kinds of political and social deconstruction at the same time, which is enhancing the sense of isolation. So today we're going to talk about how we experience our interconnectivity with the rest of the world, how we redefine ourselves in terms of what we think we are and how we perceive the rest of reality. So that'll be our session. But before we dive into that very deep domain, let us take a moment, as we always do, to just pause and center ourselves in our bodies. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes and place your attention on your heart. See if you can listen to your heartbeat for the next minute or so, in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that whatever our circumstances, it's great to be alive at this moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Merry, who has gathered a couple of scientists and researchers in the domain of the paraphenomenal and our more general exploration as human beings for how we can perceive more widely and interconnect more broadly with the rest of reality. A particularly important domain to explore at this time of such social isolation for such a long period of time. I can't think of any other time in human history where people were forced by their governments to stay home in lockdown and engage in physical isolation from each other as a matter of public policy over time. And that's had an effect. And so today we want to go to the opposite, and we want to explore the exuberance of other ways of perceiving reality. You all know Peter. He has a PhD and has explored evolutionary leadership and the quantum field and spiral dynamics. He's our chief innovation officer for Ubiquity and has really masterminded the design of our entire curricular architecture. So Peter, thank you for joining us once again, and I turn the program over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. And congratulations to you and everybody else involved for reaching day 300. A great achievement indeed, as Stanley.
Quite a milestone.
Quite a milestone, yeah. Yeah, great. I'm very much looking forward to today, and delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Jack Hunter, Professor Chris Rowe, to our session today. There is one other person we have invited who is hoping still to join us. It's Dr. David Luke. Unfortunately, he had to undergo a little, what should I say, little operation, minor operation, hopefully. He was quite optimistic he'd be able to join us, so I'm sure he will in good time. Yeah, so this theme, like this focus on, called this the art and science of interconnectedness, and it was nice synchronicity that Jim had just read that Gallup poll. The reason I'm interested in this and the reason that I wanted to host a session on this is because it feels to me that the essence of humanity's challenge right now is to remember, to put back together, literally to remember our innate interconnectedness with each other and the rest of life. In fact, it feels crazy that we've somehow forgotten it. But I'm fairly convinced that it's that act of forgetting or repressing somehow for whatever reason that has enabled us to do what we've been able to do to each other and the rest of life. Otherwise, why on earth would we have done it? We couldn't have done it, I don't think, if we had actually remembered that we actually are the earth. You know, this is the earth speaking to itself right now. You're the earth listening to itself. This is the earth having a conversation. It's one living system, deeply interconnected at many levels. And if we still were, you know, if that was our perception, then I think the way we treated each other and the rest of life would be very different. And so how, you know, domains now where as humanity we're exploring this have been given various different terms. Oh, good. There's David. He's using Chris's link. So you might want to rename yourself. I think, you know, on the 3 dots at the top, David.
Professor Chris Rowe is fine by me.
So great that you could make it. Wow, that's quite a quick recovery. So cool, impressive. I was just kind of going on about why I think interconnectedness is important, and I don't think I need to repeat that for you. So But that's why I'm interested in this topic. It's why it was such a focus of my research and the whole evolution theory, and why I'm kind of hosting this conversation today. An interesting fact is, I think the three of us originally from the UK, so there may not be much diversity on the surface, but we do all have quite a diversity of backgrounds and experience, I believe. But I discovered fairly recently that there was actually a tradition in the UK that I wasn't aware of working with the fields of interconnectedness. And what we've done up until now is we kind of imported stuff from the East, like chi and all of this kind of thing. And then I rediscovered this whole concept of weird, WYRD, that Brian Bates writes about, which was actually the indigenous tradition in the British Isles of the healers and the shamans around a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of things. So I think it's also great that the three of us kind of share that context too. I think what it would be great to do to start off, guys, is just to hear a little bit about the work that each of you does, the kind of research fields, and then we can go into exploring some of the implications of that for how we understand reality, how we engage the world, and also maybe some of the challenges that we face in trying to communicate this to the rest of the world and why that may be so. So who would like to go? Let's let David recover a little bit. So Jack or Chris, you want to kick us off?
I can go first. Yeah, well, I am an anthropologist. My background is in anthropology, and my PhD research with the University of Bristol was on spirit mediumship in Bristol. And it sounds like, spirit mediumship and that kind of thing might be quite far removed from thinking about our interconnectedness. But actually, I've come to see that some of the things that I was noticing while doing my fieldwork with mediums actually have quite important implications more broadly for the way that we interact with other things. So, for example, one of the things that I was interested in was the ways that spirits, let's not worry about what spirits are at the moment. We might talk about that later on. But the ways that spirits become real in a particular moment. So I was attending these seances with mediums in Bristol, and I was looking at the kinds of processes that people were employing in order to make spirits real in the physical world. And what I noticed people doing was an intensive process of interaction and engagement. So the medium would be sitting in a special chair in the corner of the room, and all of the people would be sitting around that observing. And this is a crucial thing, observing. And then small movements, little sounds, little signs from the medium's body would be picked up on by the circle leader, the person who was running the seances. And over weeks, so the process of manifesting these spirits wasn't instant, it actually took a long time. But over weeks, these little movements, little twitches or little sounds would be honed in on, and a dialogue initiated essentially. Okay, so it's this interactive process, picking up on little things, engaging with them, and then in the context of a seance, the spirit is kind of becomes, socially real. So a few years later, when I finished my PhD and I started working on this permaculture project, I started to talk to lots of people who were involved in permaculture and who'd been, engaged in organic farming and things like that, different ways of cultivating land. And I started to notice that they would say that they'd had moments of what we might call, spiritual communication or some kind of a paranormal experience through the process of engaging with the land. And it's interesting that one of the first principles of permaculture is actually observe and interact. And that's exactly the same thing that I noticed in the context of these, spirit mediumship seances. So this is what I've been exploring now, most recently, is how our observation and interaction with the world can actually give rise to what we might call it spiritual or paranormal communication. And it dovetails really nicely with all the recent research on, plant consciousness and plant intelligence and that kind of thing, and how we might be interacting with that and engaging with it, through our own bodies, participating in the world. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I can hand over to someone else now.
That's great. Thanks. I could definitely come back to a lot of that. Jack, you've seeded lots of possible conversations there. Yeah, Chris, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'll probably strike out in a very different direction. So my background is in psychology. My first degree is in biological sciences, specializing in psychology. But I've always had an interest in parapsychology. And I think in many ways, parapsychology can be seen as a reaction to the way in which conventional psychologists think of what it is to be a human being. So traditionally, human beings are regarded as being essentially encapsulated. The only way in which we can know about the world around us is through our conventional senses. We are physically separated from other human beings. There's no other point of connection between us. And our consciousness, our personality, our intentions, and our desires are all byproducts of brain activity, such that when our brain dies, we also die, our personality dies with it. And that's fine as a worldview, so long as you ignore whole swathes of human experiences that suggest otherwise. And these seem to be particularly interesting in terms of understanding what it truly is to be an authentic human being. So people very, very commonly describe experiences that they've had that suggest a deep interconnectedness with other people, particularly those that they're emotionally close to, a deep interconnectedness to people who have died, so people that they were close to but who have passed on. During bereavement, over 50% of people have some kind of anomalous experience, at least surveys tell us, that suggest that that person continues to live on in some form, and that they continue to be connected to them. They still have affection and positive feeling towards them. They're still interested in the living person's life and how things progress. So I'm very interested in exploring those kinds of phenomena. And this has got a great tradition in the UK in particular. So the Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882 to explore these kinds of spiritual or religious experiences, but in a scientific fashion. So are there ways in which we can use the tools of science to demonstrate to scientists that there are phenomena here that are worthy of study and that need to be incorporated into the way in which we understand the world and we understand humans' place in it? A lot of my early work was fundamentally experimental. So I've done a lot of experiments looking at extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, and I can explain more what we mean by those terms and how you might run experiments in those things. But I've been contaminated by working closely with transpersonal psychologists, and I've become more and more persuaded of the value of more qualitative approaches to understanding lived experience. And right now, I would say among my graduate students, for example, it's something like 60-40 in terms of the focus either on qualitative, meaning-oriented understandings of what it is to have a paranormal or parapsychological experience, and about 40%, which is still along the kind of experimental statistical approach to see if we can verify those kinds of experiences under more controlled conditions in a laboratory, say. So the kind of domains I've been working in more recently are particularly looking at what are called after-death communications. We've conducted a very extensive survey asking people about those experiences to see what kinds of commonalities they have, what functions or purposes they might serve for people. And like Jack, we've also been working very closely with the medium community in the United Kingdom, because we have a collection of people here who have a range of anomalous experiences that if they disclose them to a mental health professional, they're very likely to be diagnosed with some kind of mental health condition. The flip side, and they're not, that in fact mediums present as psychologically more well than the average person in the UK. So we need to understand what's going on there that explains that. And it might be useful then to lay people. So lay people who have no particular interest in the spiritual or the paranormal, who suddenly and spontaneously have something that happens to them. And it can be distressing because they have no access to information about those experiences that can help them to understand them. And they're left with the mainstream default that they're either particularly credulous in applying a paranormal label to those experiences, or there may be something pathological going on, that these are indicative of mental ill health. Neither of those is true. And a big part of what we're trying to do is get across that message to people, including mental health professionals, that these kinds of experiences are very common and they happen to ordinary, healthy people. And they need to be understood in those ways. So that's a big part of what we do. Probably enough for now, I think.
Great. Oh, we could be here for a lot longer than an hour, 15 minutes, I think. Anyway, David.
Yeah, so I have very, very similar interests and overlap a lot with both Jack and Chris. And like Chris, my background is as a psychologist with a particular interest in parapsychology. And I did my PhD at Northampton, where Chris is based as well. And but I also delve into Jack's realm of anthropology as well. So I've been very much interested in these fields and how they all intersect and the different methods they bring. And I guess my research area has primarily been around kind of parapsychological phenomena, psi, ESP, particularly precognition, but also looking at shamanism, for want of a better word, and how we might look to kind of empirically approach that particular worldview and its kind of focus and remit upon what they do. You know, so shamans are people who go into altered states of consciousness at will in the name of their community to communicate with spirits of nature on behalf of their community and bring back useful information for healing and diagnosis and identifying suitable places for hunting and such like. So what we have here is a method of communication with nature. And it's all about interconnection, really. So my research is kind of dallied around this whole kind of construct of shamanism in many ways. Primarily, my work is looking at altered states of consciousness and parapsychology, but also I've been infected by transpersonal psychology as well, as Chris nicely put. So it's kind of the broader realm of all those experiences which take you beyond your sense of individual ego identity and connect you with some kind of other, be that, you know, spirits of nature or other people or the cosmos at large. And most of my research in the last decade or two has focused particularly on psychedelic experiences and where that intersects with parapsychology and transpersonal psychology, and also eco-psychology, how it connects people with nature. And if we were to sum up, I would say what we've discovered in this recent, you know, psychedelic research renaissance in the last decade is that psychedelics increase connectivity. And I think, you know, psychedelics, the word psychedelic, before I kind of unpack that, the word psychedelic is basically means it's kind of like a psychic amplifier, okay? So it increases whatever is already in your psyche. And so you can take psychedelics and what's going on there as a good yardstick of what altered states do, generally speaking. And that is that the increased connectivity. And we see that connectivity increase on every level that we choose to zoom in from the biological, the psychological, the sociological, the ecological, the cosmological, and even the theological. So on a biological level, we see that psychedelics increase interconnectivity within the brain itself. They help parts of the brain which don't ordinarily communicate set up dialogue with each other. We have this kind of what's called hyperconnectivity, which on a kind of cognitive level gives rise to experiences of like synesthesia, whereby we have a blending of the senses. It also helps in creative problem solving, in what we call divergent thinking, so that, you know, you come up with new ideas and fresh associations which can help create solve problems creatively, as opposed to what's called convergent thinking, this kind of everyday logical linear thinking. So we see these kind of nice cognitive corollaries, and on every other level we see that effect as well. So on a psychological level, they help people connect with their own unconscious past memories, and we see this in how they're being used to treat depression, so that people may, you know, relive old traumas in a cathartic way, which enables them to overcome trauma and deal with depression and anxiety and fear of end of life and so on. So they help connect us to our own psyche as well on this psychological level. On a sociological level, we see that psychedelics help increase pro-social behaviors, compassion, empathy, openness to experience. People become more willing to engage in other cultural practices or artistic practices. That's also closely linked to creativity as well. Reductions in authoritarianism. So people become more kind of community minded through these experiences as well. And that transcends that into an ecological level, where people feel a greater sense of connection with nature. people engage in more nature relatedness activities. They spend more time in nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. They're often more ecologically concerned, may take up ecological activism. In some survey work I did, we found that more than half of the people who had taken psychedelics engaged in more gardening, which is, would be a fantastic headline news story in the Daily Mail. Dangerous psychedelic substances turn people into rampant gardeners. And even people change their entire careers to one that's more ecologically orientated as a result of their psychedelic experiences. And then through beyond that, onto the cosmological level, people feel more connected to, the universe. They have experiences of, traveling great distances and just beholding the majesty of the universe in itself, transcending time and space. And that brings us into the parapsychological realm as well, even as far as, theological experiences of feeling connected with the divine. So some recent survey research with people have had encounter experiences with DMT, which is probably the strongest psychedelic known to humanity, and people very often have encounter experiences with some kind of other. Of those people who have had those experiences, if they were atheist before they had that experience, less than half of them remained atheist after that experience. So these are very profound, worldview shifting, life-changing experiences. But I say we could apply this whole spectrum of changes to all altered states and all exceptional human experiences, in that they have the capacity to help people feel more interconnected on every level, from the biological to the theological. So that's a little bit of what I do.
Great, David. Wow, very cool. Triggering all sorts of responses in the chat. Feel free to, review those. I'll come back to some of them in a minute as well. I just wanted to ask maybe each of you to pick, let's say, the one experiment or bit of research you've been involved in that I guess what's the best way to describe it? The one that you'd like to share the most. I was going to say that had the biggest impact on you, or that was most surprising, or that is most demonstrative of what it is that we're talking about here. Just share, because there's so much that we could talk about. Just share one of your concrete pieces of research or experiments that you've done with us. I think that'd be great to hear. Who'd like to kick us off?
Well, if I jump in first, then I'm going to kind of misinterpret the question, because I'm not going to refer to an experiment at all. I'm mainly known, I think, for the experimental work I do, and later on we can get into all that stuff about how important it is to do very carefully designed, very meticulous experiments to make sure that you rule out conventional explanations for paranormal phenomena. But by far the most moving line of research that I've been involved in involves the curation of ordinary people's spontaneous experiences. And it really picks up on the thread of what David was just talking about. And that's the sense of how deeply profound these experiences are, but also how deeply there is a taboo that encompasses them for most people. A quick aside will be, for example, I supervised a project about 15 years ago now looking at near-death experiences, and we reached out to the general public and invited people who'd never been involved in research before to share their experiences with us. People were quite trepidatious about sharing their experiences. My research assistant, was really good at putting people at ease, enabling them to relax and feel valued in that kind of dyad, that dynamic. And one lady that she interviewed, they recorded the conversation. And afterwards, because this was in the UK, they had a cup of tea as they debriefed and just chatted further. And the woman was clearly, that the relief was palpable with her, that, was that okay? Is that what you wanted? As she described what really was a fairly common or garden type of near-death experience. It had many of the core features. And my RA was able to say, that was wonderful. The features you mentioned have been reported by literally thousands and thousands of people in the literature. There are lots and lots of cases just like yours. And the person responded as if a great weight had been taken from her shoulders. This experience had happened to her maybe 15 years before the interview, and she hadn't spoken to anybody, not a soul, about it, not even a husband or a close friend or family member, for fear that something had gone wrong. She was in labor, there were complications, she lost a lot of blood, and she nearly died. She had a near-death experience, and she feared that something had gone wrong with her brain, that she had some kind of a disability, and this experience was a consequence of it. And just to have somebody say, this is a normal experience, and you are still a healthy, normal person, profoundly changed her life. We've curated collections of letters that were collected by, for example, the playwright J.B. Priestley in the UK. He was very interested in time slips, and he collected lots of instances of premonitions in the 1940s through to about the 1960s, mid-1960s. And he collected maybe 2,000 letters from people who described experiences, again, that may have happened 20 or 30 years previously and were still so clear to those people and so important to them in acting as a guiding light for the way they lived their life and what it felt to them to be a human being. This singular experience had really transformed their lives. But there's such a taboo. Each of these individuals is plowing this lone furrow with no sense that we're all in the same field. And we're all in our set furrows next to each other, having the same kinds of experiences, which we're kind of musing on deeply, but not having the courage to share with others and to recognize that we're all the same, that we all have a spiritual base. We all have that capacity for transcendence. And I think that's probably the one I'd want to start with.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
I can give one of my core ideas, if you like. The things that I've been working on for the past 10 years is what I call a non-reductive anthropology of the paranormal. So, a reductive anthropology of the paranormal basically tries to explain these kinds of experiences away in terms of the dominant models of things like social functionalism or pathology or any of those other mainstream understandings of these kinds of experiences. But based on my own experience of participating in these groups as an experiencer myself and having extraordinary experiences in seances, talking to people, you realize that these explanatory frameworks don't really cut the mustard. They don't come close to explaining the true complexity of these experiences as they play out in the flux and the flow of everyday life, like Chris is saying, for everyday people. And the tendency in parapsychology, and Chris might be able to talk about this, has been to bring these phenomena into the lab, and this is in actual fact quite a reductionist way of approaching the world, to try and bring something that happens in the flux of everyday life and emotion and try and turn it into a statistical test. And there was a great Italian anthropologist called Ernesto Di Martino who pointed this out in 1968. And he said that parapsychology has reduced these experiences down into basically, like a Xenocard experiment he was using as his example at the time. When actually, if you're an anthropologist and you go into the world and you talk to people and maybe even have experiences yourselves, you realize that these experiences occur in the midst of social dramas, like crisis apparitions and things like that occur in times of heightened emotion, which occur in natural settings, in the real world. So there's all sorts of social, cultural, psychological processes going on. So this is where my non-reductive anthropology comes in, is to sort of try to approach all of this stuff with as broad a net as possible, really, to try and understand as many of the processes that are going on as possible, rather than trying to reduce it down or try to turn it into a statistical thing. But that also includes then taking into consideration, not just the individual's psychological motivations, but also, the social things that are going on around them in the social group, and then also the cultural ideas that are dominant, at that time, because there's a lot of research to show that, culture has an important role in sort of mediating our experience of the world. So you have to take into consideration the cultural factors, and then also the ecological factors as well. And then if we bring in this idea of, like plant consciousness or other forms of non-human consciousness, then these may also be interacting as well. So you take a single paranormal experience or a mystical experience, then it occurs like in the it's like a meeting point of all of these different processes that are going on. So what I want to do is to try to think about that complexity without trying to explain it away in any single model, because I don't think any single model is enough to encompass that complexity. So I don't really know how to do that, but that's where my work is kind of headed. And I call it an ontologically flooded perspective, because you're open to all of these different possibilities simultaneously, to get as big a picture as possible. So that's one of my key ideas.
Oh, great. I love that. Ontologically flooded. What a great concept. Opening the senses rather than limiting them. Yeah. Cool. And Catherine's note, I love the realization that the other than normal is actually normal. That's why when we set up this weird experience, WYRD, that we're going to do in Yorkshire, I want the strapline to be making weird the norm. Right. So David, now, lovely to share a story, and there's been quite some responses to what you initially said, and it'd be great to touch on them. One of them was Andres, I think he only shared it to the panelists though, was asking, what do we owe to indigenous communities in the Amazon or Andes for developing and guarding this wisdom or technology? And then another point there's been quite a lot of discussion around is this idea that psychedelics essentially facilitate a shift in our state of consciousness that gives us a certain experience. And what it doesn't do is facilitate the stage development of our consciousness. So like that Ram Dass quote was, what was it? It takes you there, but it doesn't leave you there.
Yeah, very nice.
So, maybe you can weave in some of those elements.
Sure, absolutely. I'll respond to that, and then I'll pick up where Jack left off and actually take a reductive approach to talking about all these complexities that he beautifully mentioned in his ontological flooding. But of course, we do owe a massive debt of gratitude to indigenous people the world over, who've been, very poorly treated in the last 500 years and more, and yet to have kept this kind of thread of wisdom alive, and many of which are now starting to share that with the world at large. For instance, the Waradika, who I work with the last 10 years, have only really started kind of sharing their knowledge in the last 10 years, largely through kind of ecological crisis, in that their sacred lands where the peyote grows has been under threat of kind of mining incursions for all the kind of mineral resources that lay underneath the desert. And this is a desert which is, spans 1 million hectares of land, and has kind of got massive gold and silver deposits underneath, but it contains 70% of the world's cactus species, of which about 50% of which are endemic just to that particular desert region. And outside mining companies have been granted mining licenses to just basically surface mine the whole place with dynamite and cyanide and extract all the heavy metals and just basically decimate the natural habitat. So of course they've been reaching out and sharing their wisdom with the outside world in a bid to kind of stop this kind of endless incursion of extractivism. So we owe a massive debt of gratitude to them for many reasons, not least for their wisdom around their use of plant medicines, psychoactives, and yes, and of course the other quote is quite spot on. They take you there, but they don't necessarily leave you there, and that that requires work. And as Alan Watts said, it's like, I think it was Alan Watts. When you answer the phone, when you get the message, you hang up. And also the analogy of, it's like you can take the slow walk up the mountain to the top, or you can take a quick helicopter ride and zoop up there and have a look around, but you very quickly have to come back down again. Both are valid, but one gives you a more prolonged view from the top of the mountain. But psychedelics, I think, are very useful in this particular critical juncture of where we are as a species, ecologically, politically, etc. In that I think they can help in many ways. And if you're going to permit me then to just talk a little bit about the research I did, I'm going to stay on that tip and talk about, if I can share my screen, maybe I'll talk about the survey work I did looking at ecological consciousness and psychedelics. You can probably see that now, I hope. So, you know, started off by asking people, can you see that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so how much had taking psychedelics helped them interact more with nature? And a few people, very few people, said they interacted less as a result. The vast majority said they interacted more with nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. Asked them how much their connection had increased as a result of their psychedelic experiences and their concern as well. And this is one of those rare things in a psychological research survey where you get 100% of respondents saying that they agree with this particular item, that their use of psychedelics had increased their connection with nature. 100% of the psychedelic users in my survey, 150 people, is not huge, but it's substantial. And of those, 2/3 had increased concern. Interestingly, a few had decreased concern for nature. Usually, once we drill down into it, as a result of feeling that maybe nature perhaps was going to be fine, all right without us, as a result of their insights. I also wanted to see what number one psychedelic substance was most likely to get people connected with nature. It turns out it was psilocybin mushrooms by far and away. In another survey as well, we got the same finding. And we wanted to see how those attitudes had also translated into behavioral changes. I already mentioned more than 50% of participants saying that they'd increased gardening as a result of their psychedelic use. More than half also said they'd changed their diet as a result of taking psychedelics. I didn't ask specifically what that was, but presumably, vegetarian, vegan, freegan, vegan, raw, I don't know, whatever it may be, but changing their diet, hopefully in a positive direction. And my favorite statistic is the one near the bottom. The 16% of participants said they'd changed their career to something more ecologically orientated as a result of taking psychedelics. So that was, for instance, 2 people gave up whatever jobs they were doing before to take up PhDs in botany, which is in itself a kind of dying subject. So you can see how people's orientations realigns. And hopefully all those people who increased gardening weren't just growing marijuana and magic mushrooms as a result, but also some other non-psychedelic plants. But going into the transpersonal realms, as Jack pointed out, I also asked people whether or not they'd had kind of transpersonal experiences of a kind of nature orientated variety. And so I kind of tried to categorize this into 6 basic types: encounters with mythic beings, encounters with hybrid, half human, half other animal beings, plant encounters where or fungus encounters where you encounter the spirit intelligence or have some kind of communication with some non-animal species, animal encounter experiences or communications, transformation experiences where people felt transformed into another species, and visionary experiences of ecological nature. And I broke this down by different substances, and you'll see that the plant-based psychedelics were more likely to induce these kinds of experiences. So, for instance, with ayahuasca, so 37% of people had some kind of communication. This is Westerners. These aren't indigenous shamans. These are Westerners taking psychedelics. And 37% were saying they had some kind of communication with the spirit of the plant or some kind of plant intelligence. And as many as 27%, again with ayahuasca, had an experience of transforming into another species. So this isn't, you never see this on the advertisements or the labeling for, ayahuasca tourism. Go to Peru, solve your depression or increase your KPI for your new app with your some kind of creative problem solving insights. But nobody ever mentions the fact you may actually feel like you've been transformed into another species and have this first person experience. So these are kind of epically transformative transpersonal experiences, which I think are in part driving people's increased ecological consciousness as a result of their psychedelic experiences. Now they take you there, and do they necessarily leave you there? Well, we do find long-term changes in kind of nature relatedness as a result. And I think this has various applications, which I'm going to just quickly run over. One is enhancing biophilia and eco-consciousness, changing attitudes, changing behaviors, making people turn into rampant gardeners, etc. Enhancing well-being, because we know the more time spent in nature is good for well-being. And so if you use this in synchrony with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which we know enhances well-being and reduces depression, if it makes people more connected with nature, then we're probably going to have better long-term efficacy in that people then, as a result, also spend more time in nature. And even every hour you spend in nature reduces anxiety and stress. So, you know, that has a kind of like a synergistic turbo-like effect in reducing people's depression and anxiety and increasing well-being. So we've put out a paper last year suggesting that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy shouldn't necessarily be done in hospitals. It should be done in nature reserves. And then if you take into account the increase in creative problem solving, then perhaps we could utilize psychedelics in resolving some of our ecological crises. So imagine if we take agriculturalists, permaculturalists, architects, ecologists, biologists, and they are given psychedelics with a view to creatively problem solving their particular ecological concerns, they may get better insights. And I'm going to give you an example of this. So we ran this LSD creative problem solving research study, a clinical trial at a hospital in North London, but we invited as participants top level scientists from Cambridge, Imperial College, Oxford. They all had PhDs in hard sciences, botany, biology, physics, maths, engineering, material science. We had 40 participants. We gave them psychedelics, most of them for the first time in their life, and they had to creatively problem solve something, an intractable problem from their research domain. And everybody felt like they had some kind of breakthrough. The classic example for me is, and this is still embargoed, this research, but luckily Merlin Sheldrake published this book just last year, in which he talked about, in the very first chapter, his experience of being a participant in this experiment. Now, he's a biologist, and his PhD at Cambridge was working on the relationship between a plant and a fungus, which apparently the plant had a parasitic relationship with the fungus, but he wanted to get more inside this conundrum and inspect it some more. We gave him LSD to work on his PhD problem, and he had the experience of being transformed into the fungus, first person perspective, and growing inside the rootstock of the plant. And so we said to him, great, you know, did you get any insights? What was it like? And he said, slimy. And we were like, oh no, this is a bit disappointing. He hasn't really come away with any good insights. But fortunately, when he published his book, you see that actually this gave him a massive insight into the potential nature of this relationship. And he felt like, well, you have to read the book. I don't want to give it away for you, but it did change his perspective on the nature of this seemingly parasitic relationship. So, you know, this is kind of how altered state psychedelics could be used for creative problem solving to get inside real ecological, biological, 21st century academic and applied concerns by, you know, transcending that subject-object boundary and having first-person experiences. And I think we also, talking about this debt of gratitude to indigenous people, I think psychedelics, we can learn a lot from the use of psychedelics from them and about how they utilize them for their interspecies relationships, for reducing species centricism, you know, this idea that we're at the top of the food chain, that, you know, human beings are in control, that they utilize psychedelics for communications with nature in a way to enhance harmony between species through reciprocity that you never take without giving back. And I think there's a few other tips we can learn from indigenous shamanic psychedelic using tribes about shamanic practices like the use of doctor plants to understand the nature of plants and what they can give us medicinally in terms of their healing capacities, and also how they use them into their relationships to manipulate weather. But I'll leave it there.
Wow.
I'll stop sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Well, what I'd like to do is actually continue along in a way. You've started to touch on a theme that I'd like to continue on a bit with Jack and Chris as well, which is, you know, what what are the implications of your findings, and also the worldview that you have developed as a result of this work? What are the implications of that for how we could be addressing these kind of seemingly massive challenges that we're facing at the moment as humanity? I mean, David started to touch on it, but I'd love to hear, like, your thoughts on the kind of so what question. Very interesting, and we seem to be facing some pretty major challenges now. So how can this help us address those?
I guess I'd like to pick up on David's comments about the use of psychedelics in order to kind of access our own resources to problem solve and to draw on our greater knowledge base than we seem to have with our ordinary waking state. The way in which we normally engage with the environment around us is evolutionarily driven. It is focused on the here and now and on the immediate. And that's to the exclusion of other things. And I think psychology is catching up with discoveries that parapsychology was perhaps making in the 50s and 60s in relation to the importance of our individual unconscious processes and enhancing our access to those resources so that they become available to us to affect our behavior and so on. So the track for this is something like this. So a number of researchers surveyed the situations in which people, again, ordinary people rather than shamans or gifted psychics or mediums, the ordinary person would have a spontaneous experience of transcendence, of deep interconnection with somebody else in a way which was powerful because it doesn't happen all the time. It's really quite rare, and it's quite, in some ways, quite startling when it happens for them. And very commonly, they may be meditating, they may find that they were drifting off to sleep, they may be fully dreaming, they may be engaged in some kind of mundane practice, so their mind was drifting off and thinking of nothing in particular. But there seemed to be some common threads that could be distilled from that informed research, but also theorizing. And they seem to reflect the idea that you needed to be in a state of mind where there was a greater permeability between that linear conscious thinking process and the inherently parallel processes that go on in the unconscious, that the majority of the work that the brain is actually doing for us, and the majority of the ways in which we gather information from around about us, either currently or even in the future or the past. And Chuck Honorton, one of the researchers looking at this, came up with a fabulous idea in relation to psychic abilities, so telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. And he suggested that rather than people coming to an experiment and being psychic, so as if this was something you switched on, actually psi is ubiquitous. That information comes through the system all the time, continuously, but the problem is that most often it is drowned out by other sources of information. And it drew on Aldous Huxley's notion of a reducing valve and the idea that there's a competition for cognitive resources. And very often they're crowded out. They're crowded out by the here and now, the dominance of visual information, the dominance of, being worried about what we're going to have for dinner or what time the kids are going to come home from school and those kinds of preoccupations. And that led to a subtle shift in the kind of research that people did that shifted people, the participants, into situations where there was that more ready, free flow of information between those two parts of ourselves. And I think that's really powerful. That's a really powerful way to conceive of things. I'm very much in the school of thought that, of course, it's really important to work with adepts, so people who are particularly gifted and maybe have crafted particular practices. But I think it's really important to recognize that we're interested in a feature, an aspect that we all share as human beings. And so we need to explore how we might be able to cultivate that in people who work in a shopping center or who drive a bus for a living, because they equally can benefit from this. And so I think over time that has led to a situation where people can cultivate these subtle shifts in conscious state that allow us to access that wider source of information and use it for things like problem solving in our own lives, trying to engage with our higher self and get a sense of direction or connection. So for me, that's been a really important journey that parapsychology has been along. And we see that in subtle ways now. So a big line of research in parapsychology at the moment is in non-conscious responses to information. So either physiological reactions to information that you don't have any conscious awareness of, and people respond appropriately even though they have no awareness of what a stimulus is. Their body prepares for the right kind of response, and people make better judgments than they should do in situations where they've got limited information, as if they're accessing other information, but there's no thought process going on that says, I must be psychic now to try and work this out. And a lovely way that that's translated is in David's own PhD work, where it's been really interesting. Instead of asking people who wanted to take part in experiments at looking at ESP, instead of asking them, do you think of yourself as particularly psychic? Have you had lots of ESP experiences? That it's just as important to ask them, well, do you find that you've been quite lucky in the way things have fallen out for you in life? Do you find that you've zigged rather than zagged at the right times and things have kind of panned out, you know, in a way that's led to healthy relationships, a secure state of kind of health and well-being? And it seems to be those people who are the ones that we should focus on. And maybe in many ways, these anomalous experiences occur most powerfully when they're unnoticed, but they still help to direct us to optimal outcomes. So I find all of that really cool and really interesting. And it fits in, it's an analogy, maybe a diluted analogy for what we see in adepts who do take psychedelics in order to create that moment here and now.
Yeah, Chris, what you said there really reminds me of like about 5-6 years ago or something now. We had a project here in the Netherlands where we got money from the Overseas Development Ministry to do something around Millennium Development Goals, and it was to deal with maternal and newborn health issues. And we brought together 20 different organizations in what we called a meshwork to see if we could get them to collaborate effectively to solve these challenges. And at the end, yeah, we had some kind of impact, but at the end of it, we all sat down, the team, and we said, it feels like we're trying to match complexity with complexity. And there's no way we realized that our cognitive capacity had the ability to, let alone map the system as a whole, or even be able to somehow predict what would happen in the system if you did this or that. And that rather a big illusion around this systems thinking that you could actually map a system and therefore with it. The complexity was just way too great. And then when we all realized that actually we'd all been on a journey, either on doing individual healing stuff, or I've been doing kind of geomancy and how you work with the energetic fields of large scale systems. And we all realized we'd all been exploring this. So we were, maybe we need to tip into that, you know, to be able to start to access in a way a simplicity, the other side of all this cognitive complexity that could help us, you know, get information and solve some of these challenges more effectively, fundamentally. So really resonate with that. Yeah. But Jack.
Yeah, I think an important point in all of this, you know, we're talking about the idea of a reducing valve, and, you know, we think about it being the brain as the reducing valve, but I also think that culture plays a big role here as well. And, you know, the different cultural systems that we're brought up in have a major influence on the kinds of experiences and things that we expect to happen to us, for example, and things that we don't expect to happen to us, but also whether these experiences are, you know, normal or pathological and all that kind of stuff. So there's a great example from the anthropologist Charles Laughlin, who talks about monophasic and polyphasic cultures. You know, so we in the West or in Britain live in largely a monophasic culture, you know, where the only state of consciousness that is useful is our everyday waking state of consciousness for taking us into work and to do our work things. And then maybe we're permitted to get drunk at the weekend if we want to, but it's not seen as a productive state of consciousness. Whereas in many indigenous and, you know, non-Western societies, there are many states of consciousness that are seen as equally as valuable as our waking state of consciousness. You know, like dreams can be sources of information, or like we've been talking about ayahuasca, or various different kinds of psychedelic states can be useful tools for gaining access to things. So yeah, this idea that psi is like ubiquitous and then we kind of tap into it, I think is also influenced by how culturally embedded or how culturally sort of connected we are to that idea. And in our society in the West, you know, we're not very connected to that idea. Doesn't mean that paranormal experiences don't happen if you live in a Western context, because obviously they do. And this is another key point that I think is that these experiences are actually pre-cultural. They interact with culture, And culture can kind of serve as like a buffer, or a kind of like an idea that we put up around ourselves to protect us. But these experiences every now and again pop through, and they shake us, and they make us realize that maybe our cultural frameworks were not complex enough. So a great example of this is with the idea of the self. So in the Western, world, we generally, anthropologists talk about a Western self, which is an individual, a single bounded kind of person. And then they contrast that with non-Western societies, which have a individual, not all non-Western societies, but some anyway, have individual models of the self, where the self might be made up of lots of different parts, or the self might have spirits that can come into it and out of it and things like that. The self is much more porous. Or the self is also made up of family relationships and things like that. So that you can't remove the person from the social context that they live in. So, this is an important point as well. So there are these different models of the self. And sometimes, if we live in, like we do, with our monophasic culture and our individual bounded, model of the self, sometimes we have an experience like a paranormal experience or a psychedelic experience that actually reveals this pre-cultural self, which, I think many non-Western traditions have latched onto and built their cultural models around that, whereas we have built our cultural models around, a bounded individual self. And that plays out in lots of different ways as well, like in capitalism and all sorts of things that we could think about. But I'll just leave it there, because that's an interesting point.
Yeah. What I was going to say was that a few of the questions that have come up in the chat have been, okay, if this is the thesis, right, that in order to be able to solve the problems that we're facing, we need to be able to access information that we can't normally access using our cognitive mind. I'd say also we need to have a deeper experience of our interconnectedness, because it's out of that experience that we'll come up with appropriate kind of solutions. But if that's what needs to happen, people have been asking, so can we or how do we train to be able to either it's access that field better, or open the gating, that's currently there, so that we can do that if it's coming in anyway. What have you guys found in your work in terms of what conditions make it more effective for people to access this kind of information, and training that can help you maybe be more open to it? So now I'm really kind of referring more to the stage development, and of course a one-off peak state experience could shake all sorts of things up that could help, but what's the work to actually get us there?
If I jump in and talk about mediumship, which is probably the area I know the most about, we've been working closely with the Spiritualist National Union in the UK for about 16, 17 years, and they have a centre near Stansted, near London, where they welcome of the order of 200 mediums each week, every week of the year from around the world. They have a Swedish week, an Italian week, and so on. And the purpose of that is to work with people who identify as mediums at various stages and help them to develop, to realize their potential. And of course, it would be nice to think that there was a model that they're working to, but it isn't. It's very much a mentorship model. So they work with a more experienced adept who helps them to develop their own pathway to where they need to go. And it isn't possible, I think, from where I'm sitting, to identify a common pathway that they may all follow. But what I have found interesting is that the initial stages look like any kind of spiritual development path, in the sense that one of the core things they focus on is the idea that we need to know ourselves much better than we ordinarily do in the 21st century. It's astonishing how little people are sensitized to their own inner state of being, that they understand their own responses to situations and to thoughts and feelings, and that a key part of the early stages of the process are a process of refinement, a process of recognition, so that they can, for example, among mediums, distinguish between self and other. So when they believe they're in contact with spirit, when spirit comes forward, that they recognize that it's different from what they would call a psychic link, that's attached directly to the client. And for me, that's very powerful. So I think a number of the pathways have that as a common initial stage, that we need to look within ourselves to find the way to reach out. And we need to learn to discover ourselves. And it's only through that process of refinement and engagement that we can start to notice in ways that then can become salient and meaningful in terms of where we go next and what we do with this. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's idiosyncratic, it's peculiar to the individual, but it maybe has that much in common, that we need to know ourselves much better than we do.
Great. Yep.
I think if you look cross-culturally as well, there are lots of different ways that, you know, human societies have developed ways of, you know, connecting with this thing. And one of them, you know, that is pretty common, you know, cross-culturally, is ceremony and ritual and that kind of thing. And just bringing, you know, it doesn't have to be ceremony in terms of like putting on robes and doing big, you know, elaborate rituals, but like a sort of a ritualized engagement with the world. So this brings it back in the idea of cultural, the importance of cultural frameworks and that kind of thing. But, you know, if we engage with the world, like Chris was saying, with that same sort of sense of intent and engagement and observation, the same kind of observing that we might do if we're looking inwards and feeling and learning about our own body, but, you know, looking out into the world as well, and thinking about the kind of the living processes of the living world too. I think that's a part of this as well.
Cool. Thanks, Jack. David, any thoughts on this? You're muted. David, you're still muted.
Hello. It wasn't saying any, and that was the most grand. I just gave the kind of answer to the meaning of the universe there, but nobody heard it. So
Again,
next time. No, I think culture is vast. Of course, if you look at kind of indigenous tribes like, you know, the Radica, they all live in a completely magical worldview. It's just part of their cosmology, you know, their Umwelt, you know, their zeitgeist. That's just where they're at, and you can palpably, tangibly feel that and interact with it and experience it just by going and being in their cultural worldview, and then it makes you realize that we live in our own cultural bubble whereby it's been sanitized and pathologized, and all the rest of these experiences have been pushed, externalized. You know, they become this other. They're not incorporated into our worldview. And, you know, like I see my role in teaching psychology in that, just kind of trying to add on the full spectrum of human experience, which myself and Chris and Jack are doing, is that, you know, in a psychology degree, they teach you about all the stuff of, you know, normal psychology, social psychology, personality, you know, things when things are going normally. And then on the extreme, on one hand, you have, you know, psychopathology, clinical psychology, what happens when people go wrong, mental illness and all the rest of it. But what they don't teach about is all the stuff on the other end of the spectrum of those exceptional experiences, which aren't necessarily pathological, with people having mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, paranormal experiences, which are the part of the full human spectrum of experience, and yet are just completely written out of the psychology curricula, apart from places like Northampton and Trinity and Greenwich, thankfully. So finding a place to put those things, and I think the main cognitive elements are kind of belief and perception. You know, our beliefs kind of limit and create our perceptual world. And, you know, what it's a matter of like seeing is believing, but believing is also seeing, right? And so until you kind of go beyond that boggle threshold and say, well, actually these experiences are possibly real and completely valid, and then you're unlikely to have those kinds of experiences, and you won't even perceive those times when you have just, you know, had a psychic episode. You would just go, oh, that was just lucky, or that was a coincidence. If you have a different psychological framing, you might see it as a precognition or a synchronicity. And so John Lilly, the kind of researcher of altered states, kind of, he summed this up in his famous dictum, which I'll try and remember, and that is, in the province of the mind, what you perceive to be real is real or becomes real within certain parameters, and those parameters are to be discovered experimentally and experientially. And when you do find those parameters, they just turn out to be more beliefs to be transcended. And he said, in the province of the mind, there are no limitations. He added a little appendix to that, and he said, though, in the province of the body, there are genuine limitations which should be observed, because he had a couple of near-death experiences based on his rather exotic research practices. So yes, remember that the body has limitations, but the mind does not. So yeah, beliefs and perceptions, I think that's, once you can shift those, anything becomes possible.
Great. I was wondering, we've been talking about the need to be able to access information that we otherwise couldn't access. I know a part of this work, that's in a way we might call it the passive kind of mode of, or receptive mode. But there's also an active mode of actually influencing that reality, as well, as we've seen through the Princeton research, and the ability of intention to shift randomness and those kind of things. And David, maybe it'd be nice to hear a little bit of your research that you are now doing around the weather and that influence of the weather and things. So I'd love to hear your insights on that side of it, the kind of influence side, and also in terms of what's been discovered around the conditions within the individual to be able to not just receive, but actually actively influence and interact with those dimensions. Oh yeah, go ahead, David. You're muted again.
Chris has done a fair amount of psychokinesis research. My shamanic weather control research hasn't really got off the ground yet. It's still in the nascent planning stages, but I have done some kind of observational work, which has rather blown my mind. But I'm yet to kind of take it to the experimental level, but that's in the planning stages. Chris, would like to talk about psychokinesis?
Well, to tell us a little bit about the observational work. You don't get away with it that easily. Come
All
on.
right then. Well, I mean, having spent 10 years working with this indigenous tribe, the Waradika, otherwise known as the Huicholi, they call themselves the Waradika. I mean, they, as with a lot of indigenous communities, they profess that they can manipulate local weather systems. We find that the world over in indigenous tribes. On this one occasion, I mean, they talk about events where their neighbors have perhaps been in a period of drought, and they'll go, okay, well, give us a cow and we'll make it rain for you. And they go and do their rituals, and sure enough, it has torrential downpour 24 hours later. But in my own experience with them, there was this one time, and we were with this one Murakami shaman, and we were going to meet these other shamans, these Murakamis. And when we arrived, we hadn't yet met them. We were going to spend a few weeks with them, and we were just about to introduce ourselves, and they all got to arguing straight away. They didn't even say hello, and there were obviously some misunderstanding between themselves, and they were just like bickering away vehemently in their own language, and we're just kind of standing around like a bunch of spare tools, these gringos, going, what's going on? And then meanwhile, behind them, this enormous dust devil got up, more like a tornado. It was a dust devil, but it was huge. It must have been 200 foot high and 40, 50 feet across or something. It was vast, and it was just sucking up all these dry maize leaves in the field, and it started coming towards us in a straight line. And I've never seen anything like that in my life, and they're just still bickering away, and it's getting to the point where it's getting really close, and it's pretty much on top of us. And I said to these guys, I just interrupt them and says, hey guys, look, just look behind you. And they turned around and they very casually went, oh, and one of them went like this, and the other one went like that, and then the thing just completely changed direction, and it, instead of coming straight forwards, it just went round us in this big arc, and then carried on and going in a straight line once it had gone round us, in the direction they seemingly deflected it. And we were like, oh my word, what's going on? Did you just... Meanwhile, they didn't miss a beat. They were back to arguing instantly. They went, yeah, like that. Anyway, blah, 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 like this. It was like completely matter of fact to them. It was completely unfazed. It was like, oh yeah, just whatever, shove that out of the way. And I can't say for certain that was any kind of psychokinetic weather control, but it certainly looked like it. So
strikes me as something that would be particularly useful in the face of climate change.
Absolutely.
Actually reminds me of Lord of the Rings, you know, when they have to stop the river kind of charging down the valley, as it were. We could do with some of that over here in the lowlands of the Netherlands and Belgium. And no, but actually quite seriously, you know, quite seriously. And I think it's that if we're able to actually build that relationship with the rest of life and get out of this illusion that we're separate from it, then potentially we can have a dialogue of, well, maybe we don't want that kind of thing, you know, going straight over us right now, and maybe we'd quite like the waters to calm down or whatever. But it's going to require the ability to make that connection first, I guess. But Chris, would you like to share a little bit with us?
Well, I feel like I've been set up because I can't compete with anything as dramatic as that. Although I have to say, when David started to tell that story, suddenly we've had a really, really heavy rainstorm that's just started out of the blue. So if you hear any thundering noises behind me, that's what that is. I can say a little bit about some of the psychokinesis work that we've done and things like the Global Consciousness Project, but I'll start by talking about non-contact healing, if I may, because one of the projects we've been involved with is that we were commissioned by an organization called the Confederation of Healing Organizations in the UK. And what they wanted us to do was to pull together all of the clinical research that had been conducted and published, looking at clinical trials testing various kinds of non-contact healing. So there are versions of Joe Ray and Reiki that you can do without having physical contact with the client, because there are clearly therapeutic benefits just through touch alone, rather than through a particular focused intention in some of those techniques. And that was really important because it allowed us to demonstrate that these phenomena are amenable to scientific investigation, that you can generate powerful, significant effects using the gold standard of clinical research, randomized controlled trials, where the individuals are blinded when they take part. So they don't know whether the person with them is a practitioner who's working for real, or whether they might be an actor who's simulating the process and counting backwards in threes or something mentally as they do that work. We still get a divergence in terms of the outcomes for the healed group versus the control group. What we added that was a little bit more innovative was to control for a confound, which is that many patients, of course, have friends and family members who pray for them or send them good intentions and wish them well. We conducted a separate meta-analysis for those studies that use what we gruesomely called non-human participants, non-whole humans. And so this involved things like animal model studies where they had maybe mice or cats. So one study, for example, involved anesthetizing rats, and they would have two rats that were anesthetized at the same time, and a healer would heal one rat and not the other, and they would simply record the time it took for them to wake up again. And they found that the healed rats woke up more quickly than the control rats in those situations. And other studies use cultured samples, so blood samples, cell samples, cancerous cells maybe, and things like that. And we find evidence of that effect. But what was really interesting from that work, and in a follow-up that we did where we looked at pagan spellcasting, was the importance for healers of working within a larger context. And in this larger context where effects have consequences, and essentially you have a pact with something greater than oneself, you're working for the greater good. And actually, very often, it is not sensible to work in relation to a particular externally set goal. So if, for example, you have somebody who has broken their leg or broken their foot, and you try and heal them, it's not sensible to focus on healing the foot, because they may have broken their foot for important spiritual reasons. They're running about helter-skelter all the time. They're not taking time out for themselves and their family. And the broken foot is actually cosmically a means for them to slow down and to pause and kind of take a kind of a bearings on where they are. And in those kinds of situations, it's for the greater good that the outcomes will transpire. They won't necessarily be in the terms that are set with some hubris by the researchers or experimenters. So we found that really useful. And certainly in the pagan spellcasting work, we came away with a clear sense that many of our participants absolutely benefited from participating in the study, though not necessarily in terms of the thing that they had identified before they took part. In terms of the PK work, so very often people try and influence the outcome of random number generators These are wonderful devices because they're one of the few systems which are truly random. Most systems are determined in some way, but we have some physical systems we know are truly random. The emission, for example, of radioactive elements from a radioactive source, and the timings between those emissions, that is truly random. And there are a bunch of other things. And those tend to be the basis for things like the Global Consciousness Project. And they suggest two ways in which we might explore the linkage between that system and our system. So one of them is what you might call a kind of a field resonance effect. We see that closely, for example, in some of Dean Radin's work, where you might get a bunch of practice meditators to come and meditate collectively in a space, and they place some RNGs, random number generators, in that space, and we find that they cohere in a way that they shouldn't ordinarily. They start to produce output which is consistent across the circuit, even though they're completely separate from one another and they shouldn't be connected. And we see that in the Roger Nelson's kind of Global Consciousness Project, where we have random number generators spread across the whole of the globe, as if this is an enormous brain, and this is our EEG system. And it seems as if those EEGs, those random number generators, are also cohering. They're speaking to each other, they're resonating in a coherent fashion, particularly around events which capture that global consciousness. So this sense that something, so for example, the Olympic Games is on at the moment. So one of Roger's events was the starting point of the 100 meters in an Olympic event. Over 1 billion people are watching TV fixated on the same event. And it's in some way, their brains may be in a coherent state, one with another, focused on that event. And that seems to translate into what we see there. And perhaps in the future, there'll be scope to use that as a predictive tool. Because maybe something like 9/11 can be avoided because we can start to see a buildup of coherence in a way that suggests something is about to happen that's going to capture world attention. That's really interesting. The other side of things, people fixating on a random number generator, trying to get it to flip heads instead of tails. We've done a bunch of studies of that sort, and we've had very little fortune with them. It isn't something that works terribly well. And we really need to understand what's going wrong there. And I suspect some of it is because we haven't captured the ecological validity of that relationship in the way that we see with something like healing. So when we sit somebody in front of a computer, no matter how engaging the task we give people, so we, for example, give people tarot readings, we have them cast the I Ching, we have them watch greyhound races, and they're wishing for one dog to run faster than the others, they're not really tapping into the fundamental need that underpins maybe that connection that people have. So we have a little bit of a way to go there. And I don't think we're peculiar in that. If you look at the overall effect sizes for PK studies, experiments, the effects are minuscule, and it's difficult to imagine they have real world effects. So I think we're doing something wrong in the way that we're exploring those things.
Great.
And
hey,
the rain
thanks
has stopped.
everybody. And we're starting to run out of time. So what I'd like to do before I hand back to Jim is just ask you each one question, which is, could you describe to everybody listening how you understand the nature of reality now, based on your work, your insights and your research? What, if you were to describe, what is the world? Right, I think it's clear enough what I'm asking. What's the nature of reality? What's the nature of this world that we live in? How would you describe it?
I've been thinking about this recently. And one of the ideas that I've been thinking about is the idea that we actually live in a world of many minds. And, when you have many minds interacting with each other, then you have obviously a world of complexity. So I think these are two key points that we need to think about going forward. And this might help us in terms of our developing like a culture that can accommodate psi or non-human consciousness or anything like that. But yeah, we need to develop a sort of a framework that we can kind of fit all of these things into. So yeah, a world of many minds and a world of complexity. And I think we'll increasingly see that actually there's many more minds than we're just starting now to welcome like plant minds into Western science, but I think it's going to go much further than that. With rocks and and more. You know, we live in this vast cosmos that's full of all sorts of intricate configurations of matter and all sorts of weird stuff that, you know, I think mind and complexity are two takeaway points for you.
Love that idea of many minds, also just not the human minds, but in a way, I guess the way I might explain it is the extensions of every entity beyond just its physical being. So if we assume that everything with a name and a boundary, everything with a boundary of some kind has both, it's all information, right? But then you just have denser information in the physical realm that we can all see, but that its information fields extend broadly and overlap with each other, so that all of those fields, as it were, though that's our many minds, right? All of which are interacting with each other. Yeah, I love it. I love, you know, pondering that when I'm walking through the woods or whatever, and thinking, wow, all of these beings around me are actually aware that I'm here. You know, it's kind of freaky at one level, but yeah. Who's going to go next?
I'm happy to
Your
go.
reality, David.
There's no small question. What is reality? Somebody cleverer than I said, reality is whatever you can get away with, which I really like. And so in that respect, you know, why constrain yourself to a simplistic physicalist, materialist kind of reality? And I think, you know, the evidence would point to something larger than that. I think we need to be epistemically and ontologically humble, in that, you know, we haven't yet even defined what life is. We know concept of what time is, dark energy, dark matter, let alone consciousness. We have no Scooby-Doo what consciousness is. So let's be, you know, quite humble in what we understand about the nature of reality. And that opens up all manner of possibilities. I think we should, well, personally, I try to be agnostic, and, you know, anything is possible. But some things are probably more probable than others. So keep an open mind, but not so much that your brains fall out. And yes, belief and perceptions limit what we can perceive and believe and experience. And so reality is whatever we can get away with, basically.
And what do you? I'm not gonna let you get away with that. What do you think you can get away with?
What
you can get away with anything on Humanity Rising, all right? You can get away with anything. So
well,
give us your take on it. Give us your latest take on it.
Experiences I've had have been so mind-blowing, and then you kind of go, wow, if that really is indicative of the true nature of reality, then it's far more than I could possibly comprehend. And then you just about get your head around that, and then something even more mind-blowing happens. And so you have to kind of keep reframing the nature of reality. And you know, I think I kind of am pushed towards a somewhat pantheistic, possibly even solipsistic view that, you know, I think consciousness is actually primary. I think matter is apparent and secondary, but yeah, I think I think consciousness has had a rough time of it this last 100 years or so and more, and I think it's actually needs to be put back into the foreground. I think yeah, we're all just wrapped up in this dream, aren't we? And anything is possible.
All right, great. Okay, Chris, time for your professorial summary.
I'll be brief this time.
Reality.
I think in a world of Wikipedia, where we're constantly being preached to tell us that these phenomena are impossible, and there's never been any credible evidence in support of the phenomena that underpin about a half of the world's population's beliefs and experiences in the paranormal domain, those claims are simply untrue. There is an evolving database here, which is comparable with other areas of the social sciences, which has been captured to the same scientific standards as those other areas. And it absolutely demonstrates that there is at least some aspects of the human self which is capable of transcending the limitations or constraints that it normally seems to be restricted by, that we can transcend time and space limitations, and we can connect more deeply with one another if the circumstances are right. I think that would be it.
Right. Brilliant. Hey, thank you all. It's been wonderful having the three of you here, and diving into this, and it's been a really, really active chat and lots of appreciation. As I said, I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but do feel free to add any links. People have been asking, how can they follow your work? Feel free to add any links in the chat. And for the folks who are organizing the after chat, as it were, if you could put that link in again, then I don't know if Chris, Jack, or David are available to be able to join, but then they can copy that and join later. That's it for now. Gonna hand back to Jim to wrap us up. Jim, nature of reality, please.
Thank you very much.
I do believe, Dr. Mary, that on day 300 of Humanity Rising, you asked the biggest question of them all, the nature of reality. So, sir, I want to hear your views. If you had to answer your own question, I would just love to hear what you would say.
Oh, Jim, that was my PhD, right? Well, it's essentially at all fractal levels, a pulsing torus of information flows that have different levels of grossness in terms of density as it moves through. So at the most dense level, we have the physical world that we kind of generally experience with our five senses, but then that physical world extends into information that is more subtle, continues to be more subtle. We can expand our abilities to read and engage with those more subtle dimensions. But everything spins like a torus, breathes in and out as the cosmos does, and as many spiritual traditions have talked about. And that breathing is essentially the flow of information up and down through these different levels of relative density of our reality. And ultimately, it's all interconnected. So there you go. That's my take on it.
Well, thank you and good night.
Civilizationtheory.net.
Well, Jack and Chris and David, thank you for a marvelous, marvelous session. This has been very exciting. And just two quick points as we close. One is, you know, this moment, I think it may have been you, Jack, or in your one of your comments, you know, this moment is so potentiated with possibility. The worst thing we can do is try to fit this expanding experience of reality into the old reductionist scientific paradigm. We have to stop being embarrassed about the truth that we carry. And I just wanted to underscore that, because this is what Peter and I and the whole Ubiquity Humanity Rising team are doing in the world of education. You know, at some point we stop trying to, you know, cut the arm to fit the sleeve of the classical accreditation, and we decided we're just going to go out and do what history and the spirit demands of us without trying to legitimize ourselves in a system that is completely anachronistic, corrupt, and actually doing serious damage to the people and to the planet. So I just wanted to say that as a way of affirming the essential message here, that what all of you are feeling in your lives, all the possibilities, you do a disservice by trying to fit into models and conventions that exercise power in the world, as the scientific reductionist paradigm does at the university level, for example. But we've got to break beyond that and do so fearlessly and courageously and collaboratively with the others who are similarly engaged. And the other thing I would say, and this is, you know, taking us to direct experience. You know, I would just say that my experience of psychedelics and particularly plant-based medicines over my lifetime, particularly in my 20s and 30s, I consider to be among the most important experiences of my life. And I would just say that we have a whole master's program that we're developing with a group out of Colombia on the psychedelic, the therapeutic use of psychedelics. You know, maybe Peter, we can be in touch with Jack and Chris and David in some way to further amplify this, because I agree with Stan Groff, who I've known for many, many years. And as you all know, on Humanity Rising, we've celebrated his 90th birthday this year, which came up on July 1st, just a few weeks ago. And he has said often that if he had to recommend one single thing for the people of the world to do to get ourselves out of this mess that we're in, he said everybody should start taking psychedelics. Because I think, David, you were making the point that when you go through this psychedelic experience, it reverberates through every aspect of your humanness and loosens you up and makes you existentially aware of what you all said. And I think, Peter, you captured exquisitely in your comment about reality, that we're in a continuum of conscious, aware, interconnected, mutually learning, cosmic living aliveness. And if we just stay inside our own little egos for our whole lives and never experience the larger ecosystem, what a waste. And there are many techniques, of course, of breaking down the ego, but one of the most effective, particularly for the Western mind, which is particularly encrusted, as mine certainly was, is the plants, the intelligence of plants. And so Ubiquity is very proud to be developing this body of work with a very, very seasoned and professional partner called Anka out of Colombia. And so I just wanted to note that, to say that we embrace all these aspects of reality. And in fact, we feel that it's urgent, given the fact that climate change is spinning out of control and we're heading into a whirlwind of turbulence, that we wake people up almost in any way that we can, so that we can turn this thing around. So Peter, once again, thank you for putting this panel together, and Jack and Chris and David, thank you for your participation. It's been very illuminating and very, very important to share. And then tomorrow, we're going to turn to a very different domain. We're going to be hearing from a woman up in the Northwest of the United States that is taking on the incarceration system in her local area. No country in the world imprisons more people per capita, and I believe absolutely, than the United States, by several orders of magnitude. And she's taking that on. So we're going to move into the incarceration system and how we can understand it more deeply, particularly in terms of its racial demographic, and how we can stop it. So that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. But today was a triumph. You expanded our minds. I am deeply, deeply grateful. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you again here tomorrow on Humanity Rising, same time, same station. And you're all welcome now to join our after chat. Bye for now. Thanks, guys. Thank Thank you, Peter.